Our third presentation, in the meantime, is going to be shared with us by Sir Audrey Morallo, Miss Jennica Gan, and Rizza Mae Baligad. They are sharing with us the communicative language use of children in low-income communities, a research to build on. As you can see, this is very related to um, the previous paper that was shared with us. So without further ado, I would like to invite them to share their video. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I am Rizza Baligad from the Education Research Program representing the Language Capture and Ethnography team. Our research is on communicative language use of children in low-income communities, research to build on. Presenting with me are Teacher Jennica Varias from the UP Integrated School and Assistant Professor Audrey Morallo from the UP College of Education. Our team also include Associate Professor Romilin Mitila, Assistant Professors Ana Maria Margarita Salvatore and Rizza Zara from the UP College of Education, and Senior Research Associate Margaret Mary Rosary Carmel Fua from the Education Research Program. Just a brief background. We are working on a bigger study on the patterns of language use of children in economically disadvantaged communities and the language input from their home environment. Specifically, we intend to investigate the communicative activities children regularly engage in, the characteristics of home language interactions, and the characteristics of child language. For this presentation, our team will report the results of a semi-systematic literature review which we conducted to inform the bigger study. What is a semi-systematic literature review and why do we do it? According to Snyder, a semi-systematic literature review gives an overview of research in a particular area to track its development over time. It may help in setting research agenda and building theoretical models. As compared to a systematic literature review, the research questions are broader and the search strategy may or may not be systematic. For the methodology, there were 3 phases in reviewing the articles. In designing the review, we determined the research questions, inclusion and exclusion criteria, databases, and search keywords. In conducting the review, we screened abstracts, article titles, and the text itself. Finally, in analyzing the data, we coded the shortlisted articles according to the guide questions. Here are the research questions. What has been done in the reviewed research on the language of children in communicative activities in low-resource communities? How can we build on these studies? Here are the inclusion and exclusion criteria. On the left of the screen are the databases we selected articles from, and on the right are the search keywords. In conducting the review, our team members were assigned 2 or more databases from which to do a search. Initially, 2,130 articles surfaced, but after removing the duplicates, the number was reduced to 2,059. The 2,059 articles were then divided among 3 pairs of reviewers for the abstract screening. Each pair was composed of a researcher with a background in language education and literacy education. From 2,059, only 31 articles made it to the first screening list. Our team felt that 31 articles were too few for a semi-systematic literature review, hence we looked at the references used in the 31 articles to discern which among these may be included in our second screening. The pairs examined 2,073 titles, in which only 137 qualified for the abstract screening. Out of 137 abstracts, only 39 were shortlisted to be included in the second screening list. The 70 articles from the first and second screenings were further reduced to 49 after the team members read the full articles assigned to them. Teacher Jen will discuss the next step, which is the Phase 3 analysis.
Good day, everyone. So now for the Phase 3 analysis, the team developed a coding matrix where the highlights of the studies were encoded. These include what research says about the relationship between the home language environment and oral language development of children. We also checked different aspects of home language interactions that were studied, as well as the oral language development aspects. We also looked into the lenses that were used, the tools and instruments that were developed, the ethnicities of the samples, and since we're looking at the home language interactions, we wanted to know the relationship of the communicative partners to the children participants. We checked the design of the studies, then the results, conclusions, implications, and limitations of the studies. And finally, we looked at the research gaps so we know how we can build on them. After developing this coding protocol, the articles were divided among the team members and we read and coded each article and met to discuss and synthesize the results of our analysis. So now we proceed to the results. So to answer the first question, what has been done in the reviewed research on the language of children and communicative activities in low resource communities? We would like to share with you what we have found on the 49 articles that were coded. So all of these studies looked into the home language interactions. Specifically, these are the variables that were studied. They looked into the language exposure and use of children at home, so that's the language input and output. Some investigated on the type of talk or the quality of interaction, while others focus on the amount of talk and the mean length of utterances. A lot of studies also look into the parent interactional techniques. Examples of these are when communicative partners label the pictures, they repeat some words, they paraphrase, or maybe they make use of diverse and sophisticated vocabulary. They respond contingently, use the contextualized utterances, and ask different types of questions. Other studies also investigated the use of abstract language, narrative elements, story components, and contents. And these interactions were observed mostly during a shared reading activity, using mostly storybooks, while some or a few studies made use of an informative book and a prompting board. Other interactions were observed during a narrative co-construction, mealtime, playtime, and other everyday routines at home. It is important to note that these interactions were mostly prompted and not observed in a natural setting. Now, on the oral language development. We noticed a big number of studies looking into specifically the influence of the home language interactions on the receptive and expressive vocabulary of the children. While some studies focus on the narrative talk, storytelling skills, conversational skills, and use of the contextualized language and oral comprehension. Although the focus of our study or main study is on the relationship between home language environment and the children's oral language development, we noted quite a number of the reviewed studies looked into the influence of the home literacy environment on children's language. So the focus there was looking into the literacy practices, the literacy resources or materials available at home, And number two, a lot of the studies also focused on assessing children's early literacy skills, such as letter recognition, word recognition, decoding, and grammar awareness. Only a few studies had data on the more oral language aspect of the children's development. We found that these studies mostly use the following lenses: sociocultural, ecological, constructivist theories. Yet with these theoretical lenses, majority of the studies used a quantitative design. Some used mixed methods, and very few used a qualitative design. And here are some of the samples of the tools that were used in the studies. As you can see, standardized tests were used to measure children's vocabulary. Majority of the interactions were audio or video recorded and then observed. Many of the studies were conducted in the US with mixed ethnicities. There were limited studies in other countries and in Asia, or to be specific, in our country. It is also important to highlight that majority of the communicative partners were mothers. Only a few fathers and other caregivers were included in these studies. Now, there is considerable attention on the quantity and specific qualities of input from mothers, fathers, and other caregivers and their impact on the literacy development. Results of the studies highlight that home language interactions and home literacy environment are important in fostering children's language and literacy development. A lot of correlations were also found between the quantity and quality of input at home and the children's literacy development. And lastly, there are also factors or hopefully possible solutions or ways that can minimize the detrimental effects of low income on children's language development. And now for the next research question, here is Teacher Audrey. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teacher Jen. At this point, let us now discuss how we can build on these studies. First, we can look at home interactions with different family members instead of only focusing on interactions with mothers, fathers, or other adult caregivers. This is relevant in the Philippine context where households may include extended family members. For example, input of siblings may be supportive of the oral language development of children in the early years. In order to capture this reality among Filipino families, we need to make sure that we do a maximum variation sampling among our participants from low SES families. Next, an ethnographic account of children's language development that takes into consideration specific patterns of language use in particular environments may be done. Patterns that may come out of this analysis can provide information to schools, which can help them better plan their literacy and language interaction. We can also conduct more naturalistic observations and mixed methods investigations of families engaged in routine home interactions. Many of the studies in this semi-systematic review observed shared book reading events between parents and children. However, it is not yet evident if shared book reading is a regular occurrence in low SES Filipino households. Other contexts of interactions between children and members of the household may also be sources of linguistic input critical in their language development. The quality of these interactions can also be investigated to identify specific ways that impact the quality and patterns of children's language, oral language. Longitudinal studies of the features and quality of Filipino child language output can also be investigated. This will allow us to identify specific stages that their language development goes through and how different factors impact the trajectory of this development. Studies can also design interventions that can help caregivers in providing input and interactive experiences that best facilitate child language development at various stages. These interventions might cover strategies that parents can employ in engaging in the contextualized talk with children. Aside from the home, studies can also focus on other avenues of interaction, such as street conversations among neighbors, where Filipino children can get linguistic input, which can also affect their language development. Future research can also gather more robust evidence that will help us more firmly pinpoint causal relationships between input and output features. This semi-systematic review of selected studies on communicative language at home in low SES contexts has found that many of the studies focused on mother-child interactions. There were also a few instances of father-child interactions. Almost all the studies that were reviewed employed a contrived environment. It was rare for the studies in the literature review to focus on parent-child interaction in the context of daily family routines. Most of the qualitative studies we found on home interactions and language development were quantitative in nature. Oral language development was measured through tools such as PVT and EVT. The quality of child output was seldom scrutinized. Parent-child interactions were seen vis-a-vis the development of literacy skills in addition to language development. Finally, qualitative investigations on home language interactions and children's oral language development are limited in the literature. What are some of the implications for teaching of the results of this semi-systematic review? First, we found that we need to identify avenues where oral language develops naturally at home. We also need to recognize the importance of homeschool partnerships in the development of children's oral language. We also need to encourage parents to promote the oral language of their children at different age points. For teachers, they need to collect baseline data in order for them to be able to examine the language that children use at home. Finally, we need to recognize the importance of oral language in the literacy development of children. What about the implications for research of the results of this semi-systematic review? First, there's a need for us to study the different aspects of the quality of children's oral output. There's also a need for us to study the influence of adult input on the quality of child output. There's also a gap in terms of research on interventions that can foster children's language development. We can also investigate the different types and contexts of input, such as ambient input, child-directed input, and purposeful input from adult caregivers. Finally, we need to investigate or study the effects of the home language environment, which includes the available print materials at home and in the community, on the oral language development of children. Before we end our session, we would like to thank the following individuals for their invaluable assistance in our research. First, we would like to thank Dr. Eufrasio Abaya for sharing his knowledge and insights in a brown bag session, which helped us in sharpening the focus of our endeavor. We would also like to express our thanks to Ms. Merlin A. Sornoza and Crizel Joy P. Garcia for their assistance in searching research databases for the articles that we would need in this review. Finally, we would also like to thank Dr. Kevin Carl Santos for his advice on some quantitative issues that we encountered. These are the references that we consulted or used in the conduct of the semi-systematic review. Again, thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, teachers Audrey, Jennica, and of course to Miss Rizza. We'd like to invite you to turn on your cameras and microphones for a brief open forum. Again, we encourage our participants in the Zoom to please post your questions on the Q&A. I'm sure that our panel members will be more than happy to answer your questions. But let me kick it off by first asking Riza, could you please go back to telling us about the inclusion and exclusion criteria for the materials that you worked on? Thank you.
Okay. So, hello po. Ayan. So, our team po decided to include peer-reviewed journal articles and research project reports published in 2010 onwards po. For seminal works naman po, seminal works published before 2010 po were also considered. Also, the samples po should be 4 to 6-year-old children po from low-income families. Teacher Dina muted po.
Sorry. Would you like to add anything to the answer of Riza? Sir Audrey and Jen? Just to follow through, in the articles that you worked on, the 31 papers, am I right? It was 31 papers at the end of your screening process?
49 po.
49. 49 at the end of your screening process. How many of those were from the Philippines? Yes, please go ahead.
Teacher
All right. Yes po. Actually, none out of the 49 articles, none came from the Philippines. No studies were based in the Philippines.
Right. So that in itself is a major gap already in our work for this particular area of research. How about Southeast Asia? Were there more? Audrey?
Hi, Teach. I think from most of the work po came from the US and some South American countries. If I'm not mistaken, the only Asian country lang yata that had representative in the sample is Taiwan or China. So yun lang po
Taiwan
yung
and Hong Kong po.
Hong Kong, okay. Taiwan and Hong Kong. So those are the only countries where Asian countries that are represented in the 49 articles that we reviewed. So there's a big gap in terms of research in this area, in the Philippines and even in the Asian region.
Yeah, that's very glaring. No, I was wondering about it during your presentation, and that's really very glaring. At the moment, I don't think we have questions yet on our Q&A. I do have one more question. I think that your inquiry is really interesting and powerful and has potential in engaging local community researchers. Did you come across a paper that included research enumerators or not just participants, but they are the ones actually conducting the research in their communities about the language of children? Because that is in essentially a co-production kind of thing, but rather than co-production, it is co-researching with the communities that you are targeting. Did you come across any of those kinds of studies, and are you willing to trailblaze in this area if ever?
Teach hype. With regard to how do I put it? Partnering with local communities to conduct the research in terms of the studies that we reviewed. At least in terms of the studies that I reviewed, I didn't see a lot of studies that partnered with local communities in the strictest sense. What we saw was that you had researchers from the universities usually, and then taking advantage of programs. It can be school board programs, local community programs, in order to identify the participants that they would include in the research. Many of the studies also had, since they were taking participants from programs, many of the studies made use of databases that and information from these local programs. Because when you join a local program, for example, let's say a program that tries to train parents in terms of developing the oral language or literacy skills of students, of course, these families would provide these local programs with information. And this information, these data provided by parents were used by the researchers. Yun po. But of course, we understand that involving community researchers is very, very important. And we can see several avenues through which we can do that, at least in the Philippines. Um, for one, we can, for example, make a database or prepare a database of research investigations. At least we can start with studies on a particular topic, and then we can build on this small database so that local researchers would have access to studies from abroad, and even and from different communities in the Philippines. I'm not sure if it's simply because of a dearth of research on Filipino language children's oral language development, but it's possible that we just don't have access to local studies that have been produced. Baka hindi lang sila na target ng ating international databases, because publication is another hurdle that they need to overcome. So if we have a local database that can provide our local community researchers with access to international and local studies, that's one way to engage our local community partners.
Thank you. Would you like to add anything, Jen? Are you there, Jen? Parang wala si Jen, no? Fluctuate yata yung connection ni Jen. Anyway, thank you for answering the questions. Your study is really interesting. You know, theoretical review is very hard to do. It's really hard to do, and the selection criteria is most important for coming up with generalizations that will be useful for your subsequent projects. I invite everyone to please give a round of applause for Jen, for Audrey, and for Rizza. Thank you very much. Lots of hearts, everyone. They did hard work. Imagine from 2000 to 49. Imagine that. Thank you very much, and good luck with your next phases of the study.